Very well. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So, this is our second session devoted to Julius Evola and his writings. I took considerable pains last time to mention exactly the distinguishing, here he is, the distinguishing features of Julius Evola, what really singles him out and how different he is from René Guénon. We spoke at length about René Guénon. And I think I mentioned that Evola is somebody of a warrior temperament. He is kind of a classic Kshatriya type because he constantly returns to the theme of a kind of heroic spirituality and a kind of really what we would speak of in the Islamic tradition as the greater jihad, the greater struggle. Jihad is sometimes translated as a holy war, which is not really accurate, but from another point of view, it's not inaccurate either, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I'll return to that as we proceed in today's session. Julius Evola is a kind of a kshatriya. He's not a, we could say, a pure sort of pneumatic or a pure contemplative. He very much favors this notion of a kind of warrior sage or warrior ideal. And in the passages which we're going to look at today, this becomes very, very clear. So we're going to talk a little bit because we didn't get to, I think last time, we're actually kind of behind on this reading list. This was pretty ambitious, but we're going to try and do our best. So we're not going to skip anything. So the last time we had quite a lively discussion, and we basically just looked at orientations and his pamphlet on Get On René and Get On a Teacher for Modern Times. So we need to really look at some of the other readings today, namely the essays which form part of this beautiful book called Meditations on the Peaks, Mountain Climbing as a Metaphor, or as Metaphor, excuse me, for the Spiritual Quest. The modern world may in many ways be regarded as being utterly two-dimensional or flat, in as much as it is completely lacking in a third dimension, the dimension of verticality. And thus it does not have the notion of a kind of ascent, a rising to the heights. And I wonder, I don't know, I mean, it just occurred to me, otherwise I would have checked this. I should probably check this afterwards. But the word ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, I wonder if it has any relationship to the word asceticism. That would be interesting if it did. Or it may just be a case of similar sounding and similar spellings. Anyhow, so the modern world is a world bereft of this dimension of verticality, of the spiritual ascent, of a rising above what we may call the merely human. And it is for the lack of this dimension that Evola was very interested in mountain climbing. And it's more than a mere kind of emotional attachment or an interest in being out in virgin nature or something like this. He truly felt that the actual physical human struggle against the mountain, so to speak, against the imposing verticality of the mountain face that one can come face to face with one's own spiritual limitations and use mountain climbing as a form of overcoming them. And so the altitude, so to speak, of the mountain is an ideal means to cultivate a certain spiritual attitude, altitude and attitude. So Evola begins the essay, The Mountain and Spirituality, which is the first essay from Meditations on the Peaks. It's on begins on page 3. The opening line is, in the modern world, there are two factors that more than any others are responsible for hindering our realization of the spirituality that was known in the most ancient traditions. The first is the abstract character of our culture. The second is the glorification of a blind and frantic obsession with activity. All right. So here he is speaking of really two things. So on the one hand, you have people who are mistaken in their identification of the spirit, quote unquote, with mere book learning or erudition by sitting in libraries and university classrooms, as he says, or with what he calls intellectual games played by philosophers, or with literary or pseudo-mystical aestheticism. And then on the other hand, you have people who are who are on the opposite extreme, who are involved very much in physical activity, competition, trainings of different kinds. And they, according to Evola, have turned accomplishment in sports into an end itself. So he says that there should be a kind of balance between the so-called scholarly type and the so-called athletic type. And he sees that this difference between them, this differentiation, as being the fruit of modern decadence. Now, he sees these two extremes, as being foreign to what he calls the heroic vision of the spirit. He mentions at the bottom of the page. The heroic vision of the spirit that constituted the axis of the best Western classical traditions, which in the context of the actual renovation of Italy is being successfully evoked. So you see, a lot of these essays are in some ways dated and attached to a very, very particular historical context. But at the same time, there are truths here which transcend the particular historical moment at which they were written. And in fact, I think in most of these, at least in the first half of the book, the rest of the book, he actually talks about his actual experiences in mountain climbing. I think that these are very, very much still relevant to anyone interested in the spiritual path today. So on page 4, he says that people often forget, and I quote, that spirituality is essentially a way of life, and that its measure does not consist of notions, theories, and ideas that have been stored in one's head. Spirituality is actually what has been successfully actualized and translated into a sense of superiority, which is experienced inside the soul, and a noble demeanor, which is expressed in the body. From this perspective, he goes on, it is possible to appreciate a discipline which, although it may concern the energies of the body, will not begin and end with them, but will become instead the means to awakening a living and organic spirituality. This is the discipline of a superior inner character. He continues in the next paragraph, in the ascetic, such a discipline is present in a negative way, so to speak. In the hero, now here he is contrasting the idea of the ascetic with that of the hero. In the hero, it is present, in other words, this discipline, in a positive, affirmative way, he says, typical of the Western world. Although, if you read the introduction, which is not by him, there's an introduction here Oh, sorry, not this introduction. It's in a different, it's in the next book we're going to look at, the Metaphysics of War. Um, yes, in the Metaphysics of War, he talks about other traditions. So I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I think there is a very good connection between the notion of the hero and also the notion of the hero in warfare. But here he's focusing on mountain climbing as this kind of, as I said, as a kind of allegory or symbol, or an activity, an actual concrete activity that has this kind of transcendent character to it as well, which is associated with the hero who overcomes himself, and is therefore also connected then with the notion of a warrior aristocracy. And he turns to this in the next paragraph, where he says, however, in modern civilization, everything tends to suffocate the heroic sense of life. Just before that, he also speaks about how in antiquity, the hero had an aura of holiness or sacredness about him, and that the hero was also regarded as an initiate into some sort of a religious or esoteric movement. Heroic figures, it will come up later, were also associated with the mountain peaks, with high places. So he says again, however, in modern civilization, everything tends to suffocate the heroic sense of life. Everything is more or less mechanized, spiritually impoverished, and reduced to a prudent and regulated association of beings who are needy and have lost their self-sufficiency. The contact between man's deep and free powers and the powers of things and of nature has been cut off. Metropolitan life petrifies everything, syncopates every breath, and contaminates every spiritual well. As if that weren't enough, faint-hearted ideologies foster contempt for those values that in other times were the foundation of more rational and bright social organizations. In ancient societies, the peak of the hierarchy was occupied by the caste of warrior aristocracy, whereas today in the pacifist humanitarian utopias, especially in the Anglo-Saxon ones, attempts are made to portray the warrior as some kind of anachronism and as a dangerous and harmful entity that one day will be conveniently disposed of in the name of progress. So this is all still not only true today, but even more so. Modern life is very much characterized by, of course, living in urban environments. In the built environment, people are no longer exposed to not just nature. I mean, like nature in a safe, in a somewhat more safe environment where you just sort of live off the grid, as some people do, or as a minority of people do in America, or living out in the countryside, or maybe having a ranch or something. So in mountain climbing, it's much more severe. If you make a mistake, you will die. You will be gravely injured. And that's not the case with these people who are hyper intellectuals who sit around in libraries and talk and discuss all day, for example. That was the one contrasting extreme in the contrast between the what he called the ascetic and the athletic types. So in any form of physical activity or physical culture, there's really no way to fake it. Although in the intellectual world, especially in modern academia, you can fake quite a bit. So this is one dimension, and then on top of that, there's the idea that again in modern life we're very much sheltered from really having to struggle. There is a different kind of struggle, but it isn't this kind of struggle. It doesn't have this sort of dimension. It's just the struggle of the rat race, paying one's bills, debt peonage, things like that. And it's a very interesting that he remarks that the notion of a warrior and of a warrior aristocracy in particular is seen as a kind of an anachronism. And that's really interesting, because in the United States of America, they're constantly in the media, in the official sort of political reportage, it's always about pacifism, international law, the international rules-based order, and the notion of war and warfare, it exists, but there's a kind of hypocritical exaltation of some sort of a pacific or pacifist viewpoint, whereas in fact the United States is probably one of the most brutal, if not the most brutal regime that has ever existed in the history of mankind in terms of just sheer amount of destruction and human suffering. So this is also a very interesting point. So Evola says that if the spirit of heroism is suffocated, the heroic person will seek some sort of outlet. And mountain climbing is one such outlet. So this essay, The Mountain and Spirituality, just barely sort of just begins to touch on themes which are developed further in the essays that come after it. So not only is it an activity, a physical activity in which there is struggle and which is symbolic of the spiritual path, but he says on page 5, in ancient mythologies, the mountain peaks were regarded as the seats of the gods. This is myth, he says, but it is also the allegorical expression of a real belief that may always come alive again, sub specie interioritatis. So this essay is pretty straightforward. He's just setting up what comes afterwards.
Maybe ask a question.
Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that for Evola, the individual being the individual, to actualize the individual, is better than to be conform to the mundaneness of modern society in a way? And for instance, for him, mountain climbing, giving him a sense of purpose that was beyond just, as you mentioned, the rat race life, would be like an example.
Yeah, I mean, you could. I do think that's what he's trying to say. He's interested in mountain climbing in particular because that's something he actually did, and he was quite good at it. In fact, he was quite an accomplished mountaineer. Of course, everyone cannot do mountain climbing. But he's focusing on mountaineering in particular because of this dimension of verticality and of height. But any form, I am of the view that any form of genuine physical culture and physical training, which is not, and I repeat, which is not sport, because modern sports is just some sort of an insane religion, as you see, for example, in the fanaticism around football or soccer. In America they say soccer, or for that matter, any of these sort of sports. There are various cults of various kind of sports, but basketball is one in the United States. So these are just modern spectacles.
So I did have a related question, if I may.
Yeah.
On that, and I know, of course, he's not talking about sports, but would we be able to see someone like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or like Michael Jordan being like, in a way, like trying to, like, going back to the whole point of, it's not like, it seems to him it's not about the journey, it is about the end, right? And then them going beyond every time, and they have a set goal and trying to achieve that goal. And while of course it's a very crude example, but would someone like that be considered, would he even be willing to say that they were sort of, or no?
Absolutely not. That's modern sports. It's just a business. So when I speak of any form of genuine physical culture, which is not a sport, I have in mind something like calisthenics, a kind of training with weights, but not machines. But that has nothing to do with Evola. That's another matter. So that kind of physical culture, or what you especially find in the practice of martial arts, not necessarily just in Japan, but any of the kinds of the actual arts of war, whether that's horsemanship or archery or wrestling. So things which are not mere sport. And when I say mere sport, that's obviously modern sports with its sponsorships and jerseys and uniforms and advertising and all of this nonsense. And it's done as a performance and people come and watch. And also not the profane cult of exercise. There's a profane cult of exercise, which is only interested in physical appearances and going to gyms and having gym memberships and exercising to absurd kinds of music and so forth. In other words, the whole sacred dimension is taken out of that. And in the genuine martial arts, especially those which you find in Asia, in the so-called Orient of Asia, China and Chinese and Japanese kinds of martial arts, very, very different. You don't have this kind of sporting element, although they also have undergone a kind of corruption. And, you have sport karate and sport wushu and sport kendo and so on and so forth. So he just sets things up here. And then in the next essay called Some Remarks Concerning the Divinity of the Mountains, he looks across a few different traditional civilizations and really wants to examine the idea or the doctrine which you find all around the world of the mountain as a symbolic seat of the gods, a symbolic abode of divinities, as well as of heroes, especially fallen heroes or heroes who have become transfigured in some way. So here he begins by, again, there's some particular historical context, but he's referring to an antithesis which still exists, namely he speaks of the necessity of overcoming the limiting antithesis between a scholarly, physically weak type who is cut off from the deepest forces of the body and of life because of his self-imposed confinement to a culture made of words and books, and the sports-minded, healthy, athletic, and physically strong type who nevertheless lacks all metaphysical reference points. Again, according to Evola, in the true heroic person, or the true heroic personality type, these extremes are balanced and combined. There is a kind of balance, shall we say, between body and mind. And it is toward this end that he wants to emphasize again the metaphysical notions associated with mountains. And so he says here on page 10, in the following pages, I will offer a few comments on the traditional notion of the divinity of the mountain, looking beyond its symbols to its inner sense. Were you going to say something?
Sorry, yeah, I was saying, so what, almost like in true sense, a warrior sage in a way.
Yes. Yes. So there are myths and legends from the Chinese civilization, Western civilization, Mesoamerica. He talks about, the Aztecs, Columbian America, Egyptians, Aryan, Nordic, Germanics, Greeks, Iranians, Hindus. So in all of these, the notion is expressed in the form of myths and legends concerning either the mountain of the gods or of the heroes, which is allegedly the dwelling place of those who have been taken up there, quote unquote. How they get there is another matter. We'll discuss that. Or places inhabited by mysterious forces of glory and immortality. This glory and immortality part is pretty interesting, I think, and pretty important. We'll see why in a moment or two. So obviously, as I said earlier, the mountain represents height, elevation, altitude, verticality, ascent, and everything that is merely human is associated with the flatness of the earth, the perceived flatness of the earth. And he refers to the idea that the word human is derived from the word humus, which means soil. And this is in contrast to the mountain peaks, which touch the sky. They reach heavenward. And as is often the case, they are blanketed in a layer of snow, which glistens in the sunlight. And so there are places of illumination. And, when the sun shines on the snow-capped peaks, there's a kind of glistening. So the mountain has been regarded in all of these civilization as the most apt image for transcendental states of consciousness, for inner spiritual realization, for the apparitions, he says, of extranormal modes of being. And these extranormal modes of being are often portrayed figuratively, he says, as gods and supernatural beings. On bottom of page 10, Evola writes, thus we read not only of the mountains as symbolic seats of the gods, but we also encounter pertinent traditions such as those of the ancient Aryans living in Iran and in Media, in which people, according to Xenophon, never erected temples for their deities, but used mountain peaks to celebrate the cult of and the sacrifice to fire and the god of light. These cultures regarded mountains as worthier, more grandiose sites, analogically closer to the divine than any man-made temple or sacred building. So again, it's an utterly unspoiled natural setting, but it also has the element of verticality and of height. It's on a raised topography, the mountain. So obviously in the Hindu tradition with a capital T, the most spiritual mountains, of course, are the Himalayas. There is a sacred mountain which is called Mount Meru. Whether this is actually a physical place or is a quote-unquote mythological place is another matter. But Mount Meru is conceived to be the place where Shiva or Shivji performed, his ascetic exercises and meditations. And it was there that he incinerated Kam or Kama, the Hindu god of love. Evola explains this by saying, in the Hindu tradition, the idea of absolute asceticism and stringent purification of nature is associated with the highest mountain peak. This idea is inaccessible to anything coming from lust and desire and is therefore stable in a transcendent sense. So among Hindus today, there is a mountain. It's called Mount Kailash, which is considered to be the seat of Shiva and is considered to be a symbol and embodiment of Shiva himself. So whether that's Mount Meru or not, I don't know. And you find this notion of Mount Meru across Indic traditions. He makes an interesting remark on a possible etymology here. According to him, the Sanskrit word Paradesha means elevated site or high region, and therefore mountain peak. But then he says that Paradesha may also be etymologically associated with the Chaldean word Pardes. Chaldean, sometimes, when they use the word Chaldean, it actually means Aramaic. And the word Pardes, from which you get paradise, occurs in the Hebrew Bible. Evola rejects the dogmatic theological concept of paradise of the Judeo-Christian faith. He explicitly says so, and recognizes this in contrast to be in the primordial Aryan idea of paradise, we find an intimate association with the concept of heights of mountain peaks. This association, we shall see later on, is formulated in a clear manner in the Doric Achaean, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, notion of Olympus. So you're probably familiar with the notion of Mount Olympus in Greek religion as being the abode of the gods. It's also interesting that the ancient Greeks had what Evola calls a markedly aristocratic view of the post-mortem. In other words, of the after-death state. So the fate of most people In other words, of those people who never underwent any kind of a discipline of ascesis and therefore never elevated themselves above ordinary life and brought themselves into confrontation with the verticality of the mountain and underwent this ascesis and this ascent, and just lived at the level of ordinary life, their post-mortem abode was held to be Hades, which for Evola embodied, and I quote, a larval and residual existence after death, devoid of true consciousness, spent in the underground world of shadows. Whereas those who were heroes, he goes on to say, he writes further, whereas in the case of the heroes, he says, quote, immortality, besides the Olympian gods, was the privilege of the heroes, or in other words, was the exceptional achievement of a few superior beings, unquote. So again, he says, we find this mystery of the heights, that the heroic person disappears, becomes invisible, and is taken up into the peaks. But he says these are things should not be taken literally, but what they mean is a kind of introduction to the world beyond the senses, in which there is no death and is removed from the world of mere physicality and physical bodies. Now, these ideas are in no way confined to ancient Greece. On page 12, he says, in Buddhism, mention is made of a mountain to which those who achieve spiritual enlightenment, described by the Majjhima Nikaya, may not have pronounced that correctly, it's a Pali term, described by the Majjhima Nikaya as further men, undefeated and intact beings, extinct to and free from craving. That's the quote from the Majjhima Nikaya. They are said to disappear. The Chinese tradition of Taoism, he says, speaks of a Mount Kuan-Lun. Again, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, Kuen-Lun, on which legendary royal beings have found the potion of immortality. Something similar is found in some Eastern Islamic traditions, considering people who have gone through initiation have been taken to a mountain. He doesn't elaborate upon this, but this is the symbolic mountain known as the Mountain of Qaf, Jabal Qaf. Ancient Egyptians also talked about a mountain, Seth Amentet, he says, that houses a passage through which those who are destined to solar immortality eventually enter a triumphant land, in which, according to a hieroglyphic inscription, the leaders who dwell by the throne of the great God proclaims their eternal life and power. So he just offers example after example after example. So I'm not going to read the rest of them. I think you get the idea. And then on the next page, which is page 13, there's a kind of a break, and the essay turns in another direction. And this is what he takes to the end of the essay over the next 2 pages, or 3.5 pages. And that is the notion of a kind of sacred nectar, which is only found in the mountains. So for the ancient Greeks, that was ambrosia. For the Hindus, it's soma. And for the ancient Iranians, it's haoma. And there's also in the ancient Iranian tradition a notion of the exalted kind of glory. And then in the Western tradition, there's a notion, the Nordic tradition in particular, of Valhalla. And he wants to look at these one by one. So the Iranian term haoma corresponds to the Sanskrit soma. It's a potion of immortality. He writes, in these two ancient Aryan ideas, we have an association of different concepts, partly real and partly symbolic, partly material and partly translatable into terms describing spiritual experience. So in the Hindu tradition, soma is both a god as well as the juice of a plant that is capable of inducing feelings of exaltation. Now, what exactly soma or haoma was is a matter of considerable dispute. Orientalists have worked on this, and it's very hard to actually say what it was. The plant may well even be extinct now. but it's clear that it's some sort of a sacred plant from which a juice was extracted, which was then consumed in an act of ritual consumption and consecration, and presumably it induced certain states. All right, well, so what? Well, the point here is that this mysterious soma or haoma plant was something which grew on very high mountain peaks. The mysterious haoma grows on high mountains. So the point that he's trying to make is that, again, this whether it's ambrosia or soma or haoma, this plant and the juice that comes from it is associated with the idea of elevation and height. And the juice or the drink that is made therefrom induces a kind of enthusiasm capable of transforming, inspiring, and leading people to that which is beyond, what is beyond the merely human and mortal. So this enthusiasm in ancient Greece was associated with a kind of the divine frenzy of Dionysus. Apparently that was associated with the wild peaks of the Thracian mountains. He also speaks of a reference in the ancient Iranian Zoroastrian text known as the Yazdī, which characterizes the mountain as the seat of a kind of royal or divine glory. And this is associated with the notion of the philosopher king in the Iranian tradition. In the Iranian tradition, glory, Ḥāʾirī or far, was not an abstract concept. Now, he doesn't mention that this is associated with the philosopher king. This is what I'm telling you. It actually is. And he almost just sort of obliquely refers to it by saying that it's associated with the privilege of a luminous Aryan race. In the Iranian tradition, glory, Ḥāኢና or far, was not an abstract concept. It was conceived as a real and almost physical force, although invisible and of non-human origin. Glory was generally the privilege of the luminous Aryan race, but more specifically, it belonged to kings, priests, and conquerors belonging to this race. So he doesn't really say philosopher king, but that's what he's talking about. A sign gave witness to the presence of glory, and that was victory. Victory on the battlefield. So these essays also very nicely tie into the other book that we're going to talk about, the other book of essays called The Metaphysics of War. The glory in question here was attributed to solar origins. So again, you have the notion of height. You have the notion that this glory is associated with the sacred mountain. And again, the sacred mountain, because it's very high, is also closer, so to speak, to the sun. And so this glory, because it's associated with the luminous Aryan race and is the prerogative of kings and priests and conquerors, it is associated thus with achievements of victorious races in whom superiority was power and power was superiority in the soul, as in the solar and immortal heavenly beings. All right, so he's dealt with the idea that the mountain is the seat of haoma and soma, ambrosia. It's the seat of this kind of regal glory. And now he wants to talk about Walhalla. So then he has some remarks. I mean, this is about Richard Wagner, which we're not interested in. So the Nordic Scandinavian kind of heaven or court of fallen heroes is known as Walhalla or Valhalla with a V. He brings this up again in the Metaphysics of War. So the king of Valhalla is Odin. In Valhalla, because it is the court of fallen heroes, it expresses a notion of, again, it's a mountainous abode, and so it expresses the notion of a kind of sacred seat or privileged space of immortality. Because this is where the fallen heroes end up. On the next page, which is page 15, he says this seat of immortality is also often associated with Asgard, the city of the Asen, the divine luminous beings engaged in a perennial struggle against the dark creatures of the earth, the Elementavesen. It's a German word, I think. So obviously, Valhalla, Asgard, they are associated with the concept of the mountain. And just sort of as a conclusion, if you go down on the last paragraph of page 15, he kind of wraps it all up and says that, the mountain is the seat of awakening, of heroism, and at times of transfiguring heroic death, place of an enthusiasm leading towards transcendent states, place of a pure asceticism and of a triumphant solar force that opposes the powers that paralyze, obscure, and degrade life. These seem to comprise the ancient symbolic perception of the mountain. Nicely sums it all up. So this perception of the mountain emerges in a cycle of legends and myths that are endowed with many similar characteristics. And he actually says that, this could be elaborated upon at length, and, the above mentioned examples which he gave are just a few among quite a vast range. So that's the second essay on mountains. Then on the spirituality of the mountain, here he goes a little bit deeper into these themes. He talks about how it's very difficult to speak of the spirituality of the mountain in today's world, in the time of the Kali Yuga. And this is because, he says, the contemporary era truly lacks authentically transcendent principles and visions. And he's only interested in the symbolism of the mountain and of mountain climbing because of the transcendent principles and visions that are there. And the whole physicality of the experience of mountain climbing is also symbolic of the spiritual path. So in this essay, he tells us that he's gathered a kind of specific proof, he says, in an attempt to demonstrate that since the oldest times in almost every civilization, the mountain was uniformly regarded as the symbol of inner and transcendent states of being, and as the allegorical seat of divine natures, of heroes, and of transfigured beings who have been taken beyond the mere human condition. Some of which he already did in the previous, but here he wants to go into it in more detail. But in order to do this, on page 18, second paragraph, he says, in order to do this, and it is first necessary. In order to do what? In other words, to analyze this idea of what the mountain symbolizes, it is first necessary, he says, to reject all the contemporary interpretations of the spirituality of the mountain and of mountain climbing. All right, so what are these interpretations or assumptions? He says the first of the current assumptions is the purely lyrical view of the mountain. So he's not interested in some sort of literary rhetoric and poetical sort of lyricism, which he classifies or characterizes as the worst kind, poetry of the worst kind that consists of bourgeois sentimentalism and conventional and stereotypical idealism. From this perspective, the mountain is seen as part of the landscape from a distance and is represented as picturesque. So he's not interested in any of this kind of sentimental emotionalism about, oh, how pretty the mountains are and how nice they are and how beautiful they look and so forth. The second current assumption, which he wants to get rid of, is the one in which the spirituality of the mountain, this is at the very bottom of page 18, in which the spirituality of the mountain is conceived in terms of naturalism. This is the view of a generalization characterized by an opposite sentiment to that which I have just described. In other words, opposite to what he calls the lyrical view of the mountain. This generation, he says, the generation in which he found himself, may be characterized as the generation of the crisis, which by and large is a German product, out of an obscure need for an organic, biological, and even psychic compensation, and out of an instinctive revolt against a civilization that had become synonymous with dry intellectualism, with mechanical forces and utilitarianism, and with conformism that has occurred in an exodus toward nature and the emergence of an absolute need for the mountain to represent that which is anti-city and anti-culture. Thus, what has arisen is a new primitivist mysticism in regard to nature and the sports practiced in nature. So this is not to be confused with a literary, rhetorical, poetical, lyricist understanding. This is another kind of tendency. He wants to distinguish this from, people who are just trying to get away from what we might today call the built environment, from the life of the cities, and just to go out in nature as a kind of rebellion against, urban living. So he says we have to get rid of this assumption as well. So the mountain is really none of these things. You may find these things there, but that's not what Evola is interested in. And then in the next paragraph, he wants to say, he doesn't want to be misunderstood, and that there's nothing wrong with the idea that people, want to get some rest and relaxation and get out of the rat race of the city life and go into nature and breathe some pure air and so on and so forth. But again, this is not what he is interested in. He says the plane on which the spiritual personality may realize or strengthen its sense of itself is beyond both civilization, in the limited materialistic, social, and intellectualist senses the term has assumed in recent times, and anti-civilization, which is namely nature, understood as a mere antithesis to civilized society. This is the plane I am talking about, not that of the conditions and the best ways to repair or preserve bodies and brains that have been negatively affected by the material and psychic poisons of modern life. So even though going into the mountains might be an excellent antidote to the poisonous lifestyles of the material and the modern world with its materialism, again, this is not something which really the mountain ultimately symbolizes. So no lyricism, no naturalism. Third, bottom of page 19, it is necessary to overcome the attitude that holds the spirituality of the mountain of mountain climbing in terms of mere sensations of physical heroism. So again, it's not the mountain, and mountain climbing is not a place just to demonstrate one's physical prowess or one's mastery of the technicalities of mountain climbing. Just as naturalism on page 20, he says, has its reasons for being at a certain plane, likewise mountain climbing has its own reasons for serving as a school for the previously mentioned qualities. All right, so he wants to put aside all of these things. On page 21, another interesting quote, modern man has a totally wrong attitude in regard to what he feels. He's talking about the modern approach to sensations. Sensation is to him something that begins and ends in itself and in relation to which he is passive. He is too weak to separate from a sensation or an emotion that purely he is too weak to separate from a sensation or an emotion the purely irrational element, or that which in his sensation is merely an impression or an inner turmoil. He is incapable of deriving from it, with an interaction, something that may be used directly and actively by the spirit as superior knowledge. He goes on, this is also the case of the experience of the mountain. Those who are irresistibly attracted to the mountain have often only experienced in an emotion a greatness that is beyond their understanding. They have not learned to master a new inner state emerging from the deepest recesses of their beings. So the mountain has to be something above and beyond mere lyricism or naturalism, or the mere opportunity to demonstrate physical and technical prowess, or to have merely what he calls these mere sensations. The mountain for him can serve as a symbol which can lead to a very profound and deep inner realization. But for that, you have to go beyond the merely emotional level. The bottom of page 21 in the last paragraph, second sentence. More often than not, man stops at the emotional level, which usually has a perturbing quality, rather than a feeling of conquest and special knowledge. The irrationality of impressions, visions of inexplicable elan, and gratuitous acts of heroism urge man forward along ascending paths. Thus, he eventually begins to act from an interior motive. It is in the context of the subconscious that he finds himself introduced to a wider reality through which he is transformed to a state of calmness, self-sufficiency, simplicity, and purity. Moreover, he receives an almost supernatural flow of energies that cannot be explained through the determinism of physiology. He also feels an indomitable will to keep on going, to commit himself again, to challenge new peaks, new abysses, new faces. It is precisely in this drive that we find inadequate the translation of the material action in regard to its meaning. The transcendence of the spiritual impulse in relation to external conditions, to the deeds, the visions, and the bold actions that have propagated its awakening and that still constitute the necessary material for the concrete expression of that very drive. So I think it's very interesting. That he looks upon mountain climbing in this way, because you'll find that in traditional civilizations, mountain climbing really wasn't a thing. And other traditionalist authors have often sort of looked down on mountain climbing in a certain way, or just mentioned it in passing, by indicating that the reason people are obsessed with climbing mountains in the modern world is because they are looking for some sort of experience which they don't have, and they identify that experience with the experience of a vertical dimension. But I don't know if that's entirely true. Is that really the underlying reason? I think a lot of it is, again, just people wanting to get out of the built environment and so forth, and have these kind of physical or exotic experiences. It's also changed a lot now. If you have enough money, you can climb Mount Everest. You pay whatever the fees are, and you undergo some sort of a physical, and then they just take you to the base camp and you summit. They charge a lot of money, and there is a risk. And I'm sure you have to sign some sort of paper that says that if you get frostbite and your fingers have to be chopped off, they're not responsible. But a lot of people are just looking for this kind of escape, and it's interesting, I think, that Evola points all of that out and says, well, there's another dimension to mountain climbing. But again, I want to emphasize that what I said earlier, that aside from this notion of a direct confrontation with a vertical peak rising in front of oneself, these kind of experiences of physical struggle that are symbolic of the spiritual path can be experienced through various kinds of physical training and physical culture as well, not necessarily just in mountain climbing. So it's already we've already put in talked for about an hour, and these ideas are more or less repeated in the rest of the essays. The number 6, which is a mystic of the Tibetan mountains, is just concerned with the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Milarepa, and of course, in the land of Tibet, you have this very interesting form of Buddhism known as the Vajrayana. And again, it's a completely mountainous, it's a Himalayan plateau, a very mountainous region. And so there are many ascetics on different mountain peaks and monasteries and so forth. And there's a fascination which many people have with Tibet. I just want to say a remark about ascending and descending. There he's actually talking about skiing, and I don't think it's the same essay, but he has a similar discussion in The Bow and the Club, which he calls the psychoanalysis of skiing. I wonder if that's the same essay. It might actually be. So ascending and descending, which is on pages 43. No, it's not exactly the same. Doesn't seem exact. So there he's again talking about skiing, and again he goes out of his way to say, look, I'm not against skiing, but he wants to point out the interesting thing that people now just go up to mountains so that they can come down on skis. And he saw that also as very symbolic, because the Kali Yuga is one of a calamitous and speedy descent, a calamitous and accelerating fall. And so he sees the popularity of skiing as being kind of symbolic, again, of the world in which we live at the time, and the time in the world in which we live. There was another traditionalist author who was a mountaineer, who became a Tibetan Buddhist and was also quite prolific. He translated René Guénon's The Crisis of the Modern World into English, and that his name was Marco Pallis. He, as far as I know, only has 2 books. One is a collection of his essays on spirituality called The Way and the Mountain. It's a very nice book. And then he has an account of his own mountain climbing, which is called Peaks and Lamas. He climbed in the Himalayas, and it was there that he encountered Tibetan Buddhism, and then ultimately went on to become a Tibetan Buddhist. So I would now, with your permission, like to discuss the first 3 essays in the Metaphysics of War. But before we do that, does anyone want to ask any questions or make any comments about what we've talked about? What we've talked about is pretty straightforward, unlike last time was very involved, but these essays are somewhat more accessible. Does anyone have anything to add? Okay, I take that as a no. I didn't assign the foreword to this book, but it is, if you want to go back and read it, you can. It's by someone named John B. Morgan IV. I really don't know anything about that person. I don't know who this person is. I suppose you could search him on Google. I have not. So the book is called Metaphysics of War: Battle, Victory, and Death in the World of Tradition. It's published by London by Arctos Media. I have the 2011 edition. I think there's probably a newer edition out as well. The title is very unusual. When you think of war, you don't think of metaphysics, do you? And when you think of metaphysics, you don't think of war. So I think what Evola is trying to do here is highly original, although the traditionalist authors are not interested in originality and creativity. If they're interested in originality in any sense, it's not originality in reference to the ego, but to the origins, that is to say, rootedness in principles of a transcendent order. But this is an interesting introduction as well. And a lot of, well, I think, yeah, maybe I should have assigned the introduction or the forward, because it's confusing, because on page 7, which is the page right after the table of contents, it says introduction. But in the headings on the pages that come after, it says editor's forward. So that's somewhat infelicitous. But I think you might find it interesting, because he talks about Hinduism, he talks about Islam, he talks about various things. And the concluding the concluding sentence of the penultimate paragraph on page 19 is worth quoting from the editor's forward or the editor's introduction. So this is not Evola, but it's a nice couple of sentences. Yeah, I said that the last sentence, the last two sentences. With no significant political forces opposing the conversion of our world into a universal marketplace, the conflict of our time is the struggle to retain one's humanity in an increasingly artificial world. That is the only battle that retains any genuine significance from a traditional perspective. That's a very nice quote. So Evola is also obviously concerned with maintaining one's humanity, retaining one's humanity in the Kali Yuga. And he devoted an entire book to surviving, if you like, in the Kali Yuga, which is called Riding the Tiger. And there he speaks in very general terms. But Evola was very much impressed with Buddhism as a spiritual path, but it's Buddhism very much interpreted by him, or what he calls, the earliest teaching of the Buddha, which he spells out at length in his very well written study, The Doctrine of Awakening. So he sets out a sort of a doctrine and a spiritual path in that book for people who find themselves in the Kali Yuga. But I doubt if he would ever have identified himself as a Buddhist. Again, he's only concerned with liberation, and liberation in the sense of enlightenment, not a political sense, enlightenment in the Kali Yuga. And he has another book explicitly devoted to a particular religious tradition, and that is the Yoga of Power. And so it seems that he's offering sort of two options. He says you can, in the Kali Yuga, you can, see what these general principles are for riding the tiger. And if you really want to ride the tiger, so to speak, and surf the Kali Yuga, that's not a phrase he used, that's a modern one that's going around, then you can choose this doctrine of awakening, or you can take this more radical approach, somewhat dangerous, I think, of Tantra. And in that book, by that book, I mean The Doctrine of Awakening, he talks about varieties of ascesis, or the varieties of asceticism. And that kind of evokes a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And, he sees Buddhism as the kind of path for the Aryan again. But again, Aryan not in a racial in a biological sense, but of the noble person, of the warrior temperament, of the kshatriya temperament. So naturally, when he talks about this warrior temperament, he has in mind this spiritual kind of warfare. And indeed, the spiritual path can be seen as a kind of heated battle with the forces of the base ego, right? And at the same time, he thinks that there is, just as there is with mountain climbing or forms of physical culture and physical training, not sports. Similarly, in the actual act of war, there is a transcendent dimension. And that's what he talks about in this essay, The Forms of Warlike Heroism. He actually is interested in a phenomenology of warrior experience. And I see this phrase, a phenomenology of warrior experience, as a kind of extension of this notion of varieties of ascesis that we have in his other book, The Doctrine of Awakening. So let's just jump right in. This essay, The Forms of Warlike Heroism, from the Metaphysics of War, Battle, Victory, and Death in the World of Tradition, begins on page 21. And he straightaway says, the fundamental principle underlying all justifications of war from the point of view of human personality is heroism. This tells us a lot about Evola. I think this book is really very accessible, and it's absolutely fascinating because it gives us a very deep insight into Evola's own spiritual temperament. And it's one thing to say, yes, he's kind of a kshatriya, but here it really comes out. And you also have to remember that Evola was no mere theoretician here. He's not an armchair warrior. When the First World War happened, he went and he served. I think for some reason, health reason, more than likely, he was barred from service in the Second World War. But this didn't keep him from going about his life. And in fact, he wanted to experience danger. And he would go outside during air raids. And as a result of one of these venturings outdoors, he was hit by some kind of fragment, some kind of shrapnel, and suffered a lifelong paralysis as a result, but he never complained about it. So Evola himself has a kind of unmistakable heroic dimension, not just in his writing, but in his actual life and how he lived. So the fundamental principle underlying all justifications of war from the point of view of human personality is heroism. War, it is said, offers man the opportunity to awaken the hero who sleeps within him. War breaks the routine of comfortable life by means of its severe ordeals. It offers a transfiguring knowledge of life, life according to death. Now, if you yourself are acquainted with some kind of a warrior tradition or come from one, if you're, I can imagine someone who is of a samurai background reading this would find all of this very, very congenial. Similarly, a Shia Muslim who's brought up with the notion of martyrdom and the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam and the warrior Imam Ali alayhi salam and others, this is just perfect. It makes complete sense. I think that the modern, effeminate, emasculated, woke people, of which there are many now in the United States, and generals who are left-wing liberals, would, as they say in America, completely freak out when they read this paragraph. How could anybody say this? So that's why one reason among many that Evola is not liked. by people of that ilk. He continues in this paragraph, the moment the individual succeeds in living as a hero, even if it is the final moment of his earthly life, weighs infinitely more on the scale of values than a protracted existence spent consuming monotonously among the trivialities of cities. It's very well written. You know, I must give credit to the translator, because obviously Evola wrote this in Italian. I wonder if it's just as powerful in Italian. So we skip forward a bit, same paragraph. War makes one realize the relativity of human life, and therefore also the law of a more than life. I think he means the hereafter here. And thus war has always an anti-materialist value, a spiritual value. So he could mean the afterlife, he could mean this very life, but living it on a higher kind of, again, heroic plane. All right, so after that beautiful beginning, he acknowledges that he says it must be acknowledged that, nevertheless, it must be acknowledged that in order to define fully the conditions under which the spiritual aspect of war actually becomes apparent, it is necessary to examine the matter further and to outline a sort of phenomenology of warrior experience, distinguishing various forms and arranging them hierarchically, so as to highlight the aspect which must be regarded as paramount for the heroic experience. This is a very short but extremely well-structured essay. To arrive at this result, in other words, to distinguish the various forms in this phenomenology of warrior experience and to arrange them in a hierarchy, it is necessary to recall a doctrine with which the regular readers of Diorama, this is the journal in which these essays were published, will already be familiar. He is, of course, alluding to the doctrine of what he calls the hierarchical quadripartition, in other words, the four castes. It is the doctrine, he says, of the hierarchical quadripartition which interprets most recent history as an involutionary fall from each of the four hierarchical degrees to the next. So it's not just the hierarchy of the Brahman, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra. In other words, of the sacerdotium and the regnum, in other words, the priestly caste, the warrior, the royal warrior caste, the merchant caste, and the serf or slave caste. But it's also the four yugas of the golden age, the silver, bronze, and iron age, because each of those is associated with the rising to prominence and ascendancy of each of these four castes as well. This quadripartition, it must be recalled, is what in all traditional civilizations gave rise to four different castes: the slaves, the bourgeois. Here he's using these terms: the slaves, the bourgeois middle class, the warrior aristocracy, and bearers of a pure spiritual authority. Here, caste does not mean, as most assume, something artificial and arbitrary, but rather the place where individuals sharing the same nature, the same type of interest and vocation, the same primordial qualification gather. So Evola accepts the doctrine of caste. He doesn't have any kind of a sociological kind of explanation of it as some sort of manifestation of power dynamics within a society. He's of the view that this caste has an actual intrinsic reality and refers to an innate tendencies and vocations in people, what he calls a primordial qualification. And so each of those people lives in a different kind of way. And so this is also influences the kind of warrior experience that you're going to have. Different kinds of wars lead to different kinds of warriors and lead to different kinds of warrior experience. All right. So on page 23, as long as you understand this idea of a hierarchy in these castes, on page 23, he again emphasizes that We're not talking about just any old hierarchy, but about true hierarchy, which means that which is above and rules is really what is superior. It is necessary to refer to systems of civilization in which at the center there is a spiritual elite, and the ways of lives of the slaves, the bourgeois, and the warriors derive their ultimate meaning and supreme justification from reference to the principle, which is the specific heritage of this spiritual elite, and manifest this principle in their material activity. However, there is an abnormal state, he says. An abnormal state is arrived at if the center shifts so that the fundamental point of reference, instead of being the spiritual principle, is that of the servile caste, the bourgeois, or the warriors. So all of this applies to war. And he sees our time again as the Kali Yuga. We're entering into the last phases. So all of what I've said, or all of what he says, applies to war. On page 24, he says, this is also true of war, and thus we can approach the task we originally set ourselves of specifying the varieties of meaning which battle and heroic death can acquire. So again, that's the phenomenology of warrior experience. War has a different face in accordance with its being placed under the sign of one or another of the castes. So when war is placed under the sign of the priestly caste, obviously, war is then justified by spiritual motives. And clearly then war is seen in that kind of a situation, under those circumstances, as a path to supernatural accomplishment and the attainment of immortality by the hero. And that is the motive, he says, of holy war. So if you translated the Islamic term jihad as holy war in this kind of a context, it's not objectionable. But people, they say, people who know Arabic, they'll say that, well, the term jihad doesn't just apply to some kind of an actual warfare on the battle and heroic death and martyrdom and so forth, but refers to a kind of inner spiritual struggle. One might say that that greater jihad, as it's known, may be seen as the struggle, because jihad means struggle. The struggle to retain one's humanity in an increasingly artificial world, where political forces where political forces have turned the world into a universal marketplace. Remember from the foreword or the introduction. So it's in this context that we have the notion of holy war. What if the war is fought under the other yuga or under the other caste, in other words, the warrior aristocracy? Well, the warrior fights for honor and power. Honor and power for who? Honor and power of the sovereign, the prince, the philosopher king. They also fight for justice, for loyalty. So in the spiritual path of the hero, it's a question of honor and justice. Right? With the passage of power into the hands of the bourgeois, writes Evola, there was a deep transformation. At this point, the concept of the nation state materializes and democratizes itself, and an anti-aristocratic and naturalistic conception of the homeland is formed, so that the warrior is replaced by the soldier citizen. So under the bourgeois nation state, the true warrior is replaced by the soldier citizen. And true martyrdom is replaced by just being cannon fodder. And of course, the soldier citizen really fights simply for the defense or the conquest of land. And wars are, as he says, slyly driven by supremacist motives or tendencies originating within the economic and industrial order. Well, what about the last stage? In the last stage, leadership passes into the hands of the Shudras, the untouchables, the serfs, the slaves. And here he identifies this with Bolshevism, with communism, with what was the USSR. And here he and the war that they favored, that the Shudras favor, is illustrated by a quote he produces from Vladimir Lenin. There's no source here, but it is: the war between nations is a childish game, preoccupied by the survival of the middle class, which does not concern us. True war, our war, is the world revolution for the destruction of the bourgeois and the triumph of the proletariat. So these are so this is the phenomenology of the warrior experience. And having set that out, obviously there's different possibilities. And not all wars have the same possibilities. So what can we get out of this? Not all wars have the same possibilities, Evola says, because of this is because of analogies which are not merely abstractions, but which act positively along paths invisible to most people, between the collective character predominating in the various cycles of civilization and the element which corresponds to this character in the whole of the human entity. If in the eras of the merchants and slaves, forces prevail which correspond to the energies which define man's pre-personal, physical, instinctive, telluric, organic, vital part, then in the eras of the warriors and spiritual leaders, forces find expression which correspond respectively to what in man is character and volitional personality, and what in him is spiritualized personality realized according to its supernatural destiny. Okay, so because of all of this, because of all of these transcendent factors, it is obvious that in war, the majority cannot but collectively undergo an awakening, corresponding more or less to the predominant influence within the order of the causes which have been decisive for the outbreak of the war. So this is why some people actually undergo some sort of a profound experience if they experience warfare. But often they're not really sure what it is about it, but they just realize that they feel more alive. They somehow, in other words, they come in contact with something which is actually above them, but because they don't have the right orientation, they're not able to really understand what it is. So in the light of this quadripartite division of the castes and the four yugas, what really constitutes the possibilities of the heroic experience? Well, according to Evola, there's 3 kinds of points of arrival. 3 primary such points, he says. This is at the bottom, page 25. These points correspond basically to 3 possible types of relation in which the warrior caste and its principle can find themselves with respect to other manifestations already considered. So the first would be the normal state. In the normal state, they are subordinate to the spiritual principle. And then there breaks out a heroism which leads to a kind of supra-life, to supra-personhood. The second kind is when under the warrior principle. So the first was when it was subordinate to the spiritual principle, or the highest caste. And if it's the warrior principle, it may, however, construct its own form, refusing to recognize anything as superior to it. And then the heroic experience takes on a quality which is tragic, which is insolent, steel-tempered, but without light. Personality remains and strengthens, but at the same time, he tells us, so does the limit constituted by its naturalistic and simply human nature. But Evola still thinks that this is not so bad. He says, nevertheless, this type of hero shows a certain greatness. And naturally, for the types hierarchically inferior to the warrior, i.e. the bourgeois and the slave types, this war and this heroism already mean overcoming, elevation, and accomplishment. The third and last one involves a degraded warrior principle, which is passed into the service of hierarchically inferior elements. In other words, it's when the warriors become subordinate to the merchant class or the slaves. In such cases, Evola writes, heroic experience is united almost fatally to an evocation and an eruption of instinctual, subpersonal, collective, irrational forces, so that there occurs basically a lesion and a regression of the personality of the individual, who can only live life in a passive manner, driven either by necessity or by the suggestive power of myths and passionate impulses. That's what we have today, and he gives as an example a German novel by Erich Maria Remarque called All Quiet on the Western Front, which was made into a movie as well. And he says, this is just an example of, and it's based on his own experiences in the First World War. So this is an example of the third, where you have a degraded warrior principle, and the warrior caste becomes subordinate to and serves castes which are below it. Now, this has an interesting conclusion. At the bottom of 26 and stretching over to page 27, he says, in a preparation for war, which must be not only material, but also spiritual, it is necessary to recognize all of this with a clear and unflinching gaze, in order to be able to orientate souls and energies towards the higher solution, the only one which corresponds to the ideals from which fascism draws its inspiration. Very interesting. So he saw fascism as having a potentially positive dimension, although his own views on fascism are very much his own. You can't really characterize him, I said this last time as well, as a mere fascist. He liked fascism to the extent that he saw in it the possibility of a reconstructive revolution. He says this in the concluding paragraph on page 27. He liked the affirmation, as he saw it in fascism, of an aristocratic and spiritual concept of the nation, as against socialist and internationalist, collectivism. In other words, what was the Soviet Union, and also the democratic and demagogic notion of the nation, that's America, Britain. In addition, it's scorn for the economic myth. He's very much against the reduction of life to mere consumption, and its elevation of the nation in practice to the degree of a warrior nation. So all of this is very positive for Evola, and he saw in it the possibility, of a kind of reassertion of the warrior principle. Of course, it didn't happen, and he broke with, became actually opposed to Mussolini. And anyhow, he has written a number of writings that have to do with that deal with his views on fascism. So there's Fascism Viewed from the Right. There's Notes on the Third Reich. We're not going to be looking at any of those, but those are well-known works of his. So now let's just look at the next two essays, the Sacrality of War, and then the Meaning of the Crusades is very simple. We won't have to say much about that, but the Sacrality of War is quite interesting. So in the previous article, he looked at the phenomenology of warrior heroism, or the warrior experience. Here he wants to pick up the argument and look at conceptions related to war in the Roman tradition, ancient Rome. Here he immediately rejects the idea that the values of ancient Rome were secular. He says this is a false notion. He thinks that the principles that really made Rome great were actually sacred principles, namely the principle of the imperium and the principle of the aeternitatis. Imperium, it says in the footnote here, was a power vested in leaders of Rome and was believed to originate from divine sanction. Aeternitatis is a reference to aeternitatis imperii, meaning the eternity of Roman rule, which is who was in fact a goddess who looked after the preservation of the empire as kind of the guardian goddess or deity of the Roman Empire. So whether you accept those guardian deities or not, or the notion of the imperium, his point is that it was not a secular state. Those who want to limit themselves to a positive point of view, he says, are obliged to replace this perception, deeply felt by the Romans, with a mystery. The mystery, that is, that a handful of men, without any really compelling reasons, without even ideas of a land or homeland, and without any of the myths or passions to which the moderns so willingly resort to justify war and promote heroism, kept moving further and further from one country to the next, following a strange and irresistible impulse, basing everything on an ascesis of power. So he rejects a secular interpretation of ancient Rome. For him, the ancient Romans and the ancient Roman people were propelled by these kinds of non-secular, that is to say, sacred traditions. And that this was a kind of holy war, and hence the sacrality or holiness of war. So he's concerned very much with the warrior experience and the sacrality of war in reference to ancient Rome. He says that the Romans never went into battle without actually undergoing some kind of a sacred act of divination. In other words, what he says before, certain mystical signs had defined, so to speak, its moment. This is on page 29. Because of the mental distortions and prejudices resulting from modern education, most people of today would naturally be inclined to see in this an extrinsic, superstitious superstructure. The most benevolent may see in it an eccentric fatalism, but it is neither of these. The essence of the augural art, an augury is a divination. The essence of the augural art practiced by the Roman patriciate, like similar disciplines, with more or less the same characteristics which can easily be found in the cycle of the greater Indo-European civilizations, was not the discovery of fates to be followed with a superstitious passivity. Rather, it was the knowledge of points of juncture with invisible influences, the use of which the forces of men could be developed, multiplied, and led to act on a higher plane, in addition to the everyday one. Thus, when the harmony was perfect, bringing about the removal of every obstacle and every resistance within an event complex, which was material and spiritual at the same time. So obviously he's saying the Romans, they weren't superstitious. They practiced the divinatory art. They were motivated by these sacred ideas of imperium and eternitatis, that they took auguries before going into battle. In other words, the whole enterprise was in no way akin to modern warfare. It was a kind of sacred warfare. Similarly, when they would win, there was a ceremony of triumph. And that ceremony of triumph, again, for him is religious, and it is not militaristic in a modern sense. You know, modern militarism, where the warrior principle is subordinate to the bourgeois, the slave principle. So there would be a kind of procession. The victor would go and plant, I think it was a wreath or an insignia. Sorry, he would put a kind of sacrifice or something on the altar of the supreme god of the Capitol. Capital in footnote is the Capitolium, or the Capitol, was a temple on one of the 7 hills of Rome, which was dedicated to a triad of deities. So, in other words, the victor would go to this place and would give thanks and actually attribute the victory to that divine power. There was also this notion of a kind of imperial apotheosis, the idea of an immortal numen. And numen is a kind, N-U-M-E-N, is a kind of power which they believed in, that was capable of producing effects of acting and manifesting itself. And this kind of immortal numen, or in Sanskrit we would say like a Shakti, or a kind of quwwa or baraka in Arabic, flowed, as it were, into the through the emperor, and was embodied by the emperor. Originally, the emperor, the imperator, was actually a warrior. It was actually an actual military leader on the field of battle. And when he would be victorious, he would be, in that moment of victory, he would be seen almost as being transfigured by a force from above. And this is the Numen. Evola makes the point that this notion, this view, is not peculiar to Rome, but is found throughout the classical Mediterranean world of antiquity. And it was in fact not restricted to victory in war, but also to the winners of the Olympic Games. Now you have to remember that the Olympic Games in ancient Greece, they're not like the Olympics today. It was a sacred event. These forms of physical culture, I do not want to refer to them as sports. These arts of physical culture were performed as a sacred ritual, a sacred rite. That's what the Olympic Games were. So this concept of the Numen is also at work there in those sacred games, those sacred arts of physical culture. So some more at the bottom of page 30 when he says, let us consider some other evidence of this tradition, which by its very nature is metaphysical. Elements such as race cannot therefore possess more than a secondary contingent place in it. So even though he's talking about ancient Rome, he's not arguing for a Roman, that this was some sort of racial endowment. So he looks at some other instances such as the Christian and the Nordic. Page 32, he says the Christian component will appear with the features of a knightly supernatural heroism of the, as in the Crusades, which he talks about in the next chapter. The Nordic component he mentions further on. And here he actually criticizes National Socialism, which is Nazism. He says that the Nordic revivalism celebrated today, and he uses a Latin phrase, which doesn't really add much, but anyhow, you can look at the footnote there. It's an explanation, but it doesn't really add. By National Socialist Germany, we find mainly a deformation and vulgarization of Nordic traditions as they existed originally, and as they could still be found in those princes who considered it a great honor to be able to say of themselves that they were Romans. In other words, Roman citizens, although of the Teutonic race. So here he returns to the idea of Valhalla, which we met in the Meditations on the Peaks. As for the properly Nordic tradition, it's at bottom of page 32. Well known to all is the part which concerns Valhalla. Valhalla, of course, once again, is the seat of divine or celestial immortality, which is reserved for divine beings as well as fallen heroes. Valhalla, he tells us, means literally from the place, I'm sorry, not the place, from the palace of the chosen. The lord of this symbolic seat is Odin or Wotan, who appears in this unpronounceable word, Ynglinga Saga, as a Nordic, some kind of Viking or Nordic, what would you call it, text, as the one who by his symbolic self-sacrifice on the world tree, and I think that word actually means some kind of a tree, showed the heroes how to reach the divine sojourn where they live eternally as on a bright peak, mountain peak, remember, which remains in perpetual sunlight above every cloud. So according to this tradition, no sacrifice or form of worship was more appreciated by the supreme God and rich in supermundane fruits than that which is performed by the warrior who fights and falls on the battlefield. This very much resonates with a Shia Muslim reader because of this notion of martyrdom. And that's not all. Those heroes, the fallen heroes who are transfigured and transported to the transported to the seat of divine immortality of Valhalla, they will return at some point and participate in what is called the Ragnarok. That is when we will have the darkening of the divine, and they will take place in they will take part, in some sort of final battle against dark forces. And further on down, he talks about how this is also related to ancient Iranian traditions as well. And we spoke of the Khawarna before, or the Far, the light of royal glory. And so just as you have these beings known as the Valkyries, which choose the souls of the warriors destined for Valhalla, you have in the Persian tradition the Fravashi, who are like the Valkyries, and they actually are represented as women of light, who personify more or less the supernatural forces by means of which the human natures of the warriors faithful to the god of light can transfigure themselves and bring about terrible, overwhelming, and bloody victories. The Iranian tradition also includes the symbolic conception of a divine figure, Mithra here it's called, described as the warrior who never sleeps, who at the head of his faithful Fravashi, or the Valkyries, fights against the emissaries of the dark god until the coming of the Saoshyant, or the lord of the future kingdom of triumphant peace. The Saoshyant is a Zoroastrian concept, which is exactly like the notion of the Mahdī you find in Islam, but especially in Shia Islam. He concludes his essay by saying that these elements of ancient Indo-European tradition, in which the motifs recur of the sacrality of war and of the hero who does not really die, but becomes part of a mystical army in a cosmic battle, have had a perceptible effect on certain elements of Christianity. And that's where he sort of then segues into his discussion of the Crusades. I just want to very quickly conclude this. I'm not going to talk much about this chapter on the Crusades. He's simply here again trying to argue for the concept of not just the sacrality of war, but the notion of a sacred war or a holy war, and he identifies the Crusades as such a thing. But at the same time, it shouldn't be seen that he's sort of endorsing one side or another in the Crusades. He's arguing in this essay that the Crusades is, again, something which the modern world simply doesn't understand. That regardless of what side you may have chosen, both sides were fighting for something higher, what at least they believed to be a higher sort of principle, dying for their faith, dying for some sort of, again, sacred notions, the sacrality of war. So he just very quickly talks about how sacred war, and this is from the Christian point of view. He says at the bottom of page 36, sacred war, according to an old chronicler, should be compared to a bath like that in the fire of purgatory, but before death. The idea of traveling far, far away from Europe, to go to the so-called, to go to the Holy Land, is also a kind of evocation of certain transcendent myths, which again he speaks of on page 36. Transcendent myths, he writes, resurfaced from the subconscious in the soul of Western chivalry. The conquest of the Holy Land, located beyond the sea, was much more closely associated than many people have imagined with the ancient saga, according to which in the distant east, where the sun rises, lies the sacred city, where death does not exist, and the fortunate heroes who are able to reach it enjoy celestial serenity and perpetual life. So the Holy Land, for the Crusades becomes almost a kind of a Valhalla. And there is the notion of the heavenly Jerusalem also in Christianity. To that point on page 37, in this respect, Jerusalem, the coveted goal of the conquest, appeared in a double aspect as an earthly city and as a symbolic, celestial, and intangible city. And the crusade gained an inner value independent of all outer integuments, supports, and apparent motives. Integuments means coverings. So he's talking about this transcendent dimension all the time. So he's talks about how in the people who participate in the crusades, they recognize something superior to both victory and defeat, and to according the highest importance to the distinctive aspect of heroic action, which is accomplished independently of any visible and material fruits, almost in the sense of an offering, which draws from the virile sacrifice of all human elements the immortalizing absolute glory. And he says that when these Christian crusaders encountered the knights of Arab orders, he calls them, he says that those knights of these Arab orders, by order, he's referring to the order of the Knights Templar, which was a sacred order which was devoted to sacred warfare, against the Muslims. And so he claims that when the knights of the crusading orders found themselves in the presence of the knights of Arab orders, which were almost their doubles, he says, they manifested correspondences in ethics and customs and symbols and chivalry. So they were like twins of each other, according to Evola. And in his view, they both accorded to this war in which they were involved identical values. So I'll just conclude with one thing now. He says, those who regard the Crusades, this is Evola, direct quote, those who regard the Crusades, referring to the modern people, with indignation as among the most extravagant episodes of the dark Middle Ages, have not even the slightest suspicion that what they call religious fanaticism was the visible sign of the presence and effectiveness of a sensitivity and decisiveness, the absence of which is more characteristic of true barbarism. I'm just going to stop there. So, Evola is very much interested in emphasizing this concept of heroism, whether that be in the form of an activity like mountain climbing or of warfare. And he outlines a phenomenology of the warrior experience, which is connected with the four castes and the four yugas. And this also connects with the notion of the mountain as a symbol of height and a symbol of a kind of divine abode and the abode of heroes. So that's pretty much all I have to say. I mean, my approach is simply just to highlight certain points and read out certain passages and then leave that for discussion. So I'm done. I've spoken quite a lot and be happy to hear from you guys now.
Oh, well, it was great. One thing I was wondering about the the kind of how do I put in the metaphysics of war, and the meaning of the Crusades. I wonder if he's kind of one interesting thing he said, which might be true, is that the religions were a means to an end, and what was really expressing itself was that warrior spirit. I think that's an interesting idea, and it's kind of comes into this idea that nowadays everyone I hope this isn't too like nowadays everyone wants their religion to be peaceful, right? So that's the idea where, well, on the right, there are many right-wing people who attack Christianity, saying that you made the West too peaceful. Now look what it's come to. And then the Christians, of course, who I personally think have a more direct connection to whatever tradition is left compared to their opponents, who might be some kind of pagan or who brand themselves as some kind of pagan or something. I think
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. So to the Christians will defend themselves, and I agree kind of with the defense, is that, well, look at the Crusade example, we were like that once,
mhm,
and we have some vitality. That's evidence of some kind of vitality.
yeah,
So and Evola might, and since I know, I think you mentioned before, Evola has, more some negative things to say about Christianity as well. So in this case, he's saying that it's really the warrior spirit that's coming through, that's using Christianity as the means. And then he can't really give I mean, maybe it shouldn't be taken for granted either, that the religion is necessary for that, even though if it's expressing something a bit older, which I think makes
mhm.
sense.
Yeah, I think that Evola's interpretation of the Crusades is a very interesting one. And you're quite right when you say that among certain voices in the right, on the right of the political spectrum, you on the one hand have the committed Christians, and then you've got the ones who call themselves pagans or neo-pagans and are quite hostile to the idea of Christianity. So they're just kind of arguing with one another, and I think missing the point. And
Sure.
Evola, again, the key to understanding Evola is this notion of the hero, of the kshatriya, of the divine or the sacred warrior. He really sees that as being paramount. And wherever he sees that those kind of values are being undermined, he's against that. And so for the most part, he is opposed to Christianity because he sees Christianity, and here I think he may well have been influenced to some degree by Nietzsche, but you don't have to ever have read Nietzsche to know these things. He lived in he was brought up Catholic, but he is against these ideas in Christianity of meekness, of turning the other cheek, of a kind of cult of sin and guilt and forgiveness and divine mercy. He is very much interested in honor and justice and rigor, and not seeking some sort of salvation outside of oneself in a kind of in a Christian God, you see. And so anytime he sees an instance where those tendencies are subordinated to and then balanced by the warrior spirit, as we see in the Crusades and something like the Knights Templar, then he's in favor of it. Otherwise not.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, I found interesting the phenomenology part of the warrior experience, where
Mhm.
the implication, well, the straightforward way to think about it is, yeah, it does make sense. When different castes take control of the state, the wars they wage will be for a different purpose. So yeah, and so I think communism is, like he said, it's the most clearest example. Oh, of course, when the lowest caste takes over, their war is like very total, and everyone has to get involved. They want the whole world to rise up, that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
that part makes sense. But then it's also interesting because it's, when you talk about phenomenology, that's often associated with individual experience as well. So
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
I think about it is, when you look at kind of the radicalized woke people, I guess you can say, their mentality when they're fighting, or they're kind of I guess it would be activism nowadays, is very uh, uh, sometimes the right is baffled. How can they be so kind of mindlessly
Yeah.
radical? And then some people even say, why can't we be as radical as them, but promoting good values? And then my thought of that is, well, if they are having a it might be the phenomenology of how they go about their war. So they have a very when they're bolstered by all the Shudra caste behind them, then they will act in that unquestioning way, kind of, rather than the Kshatriya, who is, you know, individualistic in the honor seeking way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But on another, from another point of view, I mean, I wonder. I think that the stance of the liberal, liberal, neoliberal, woke, left wing people as being this nice, lovey dovey kind of pacifists, I think that's a facade. I
Definitely, yes.
think, don't you?
Yes, definitely, I agree. I mean,
Yeah, I think they're really quite vicious.
yes,
And
exactly.
when they do get in power and control of certain institutions, they're quite ruthless. But I mean, ruthless, resorting to peaceful means, institutional means, etc., of sanctions, of what is now called cancel culture, things like measures of this kind. And I shudder to think that if these people were in charge and had a monopoly on violence, in other words, they would assume power and have their very hands on the levers of the state, right? I shudder to think what they would do. And it seems to me that the United States is now, like Evola said, very much moving towards collectivism, towards a kind of Bolshevism, if you like, use that term. I hope it doesn't happen. But then again, these are forces which are beyond really anyone's control. They are subject to the involution, the cyclical laws which are in operation, that Evola talks about, and I believe that those are true. I think that is actually what's happening. So who knows what will happen?
Yeah, many are saying that, it's kind of already happened, and some will. So I think last time we talked about orientations, and he's saying our side, or to the degree that he can say of himself that he's part of a certain side, has already lost. So the traditionals have already kind of lost, and have to learn to, like you said, ride the tiger. And what that means is that the ones in power are already against what Evola stands for, and so they are this kind of lower caste having all the power, and exercising it in either, not even increasingly not trying to hide what you said about their vicious character.
Yeah.
So one of the, it's like a interesting thing. It's like, you mentioned Nietzsche, and Evola is kind of similar in the sense that, what makes something higher caste or deserving of its place on the hierarchy is not just what kind of brutality or power in the narrow sense that it can wield. Because if the Shudra wins for like 70 years or whatever in the USSR, that doesn't make them higher than the Kshatriya of in that 70 years,
Yeah, very true. Very true. So I think that this book of essays, The Metaphysics of War, really offers probably, I mean, people differ on this, but I think that this book is probably the best book that I would suggest as the first book to read. I mean, orientations is important, but even if you've never heard of Genon or anything, I mean, you could just give this book to someone and say, if you want to understand Evola, you can start here. But I thought I would go in a more systematic way. In fact, I've done that before. I remember there was a friend of mine who was, oh, I want to find out about Evola. So we'll just read this. And then, if you like it, then you can read more. Otherwise, if you don't like it, fine. So,
sure.
Yeah.
When when you're, I guess I kind of wanted, I think it's not super hard to understand the kind of, I mean, to experience it is something different, but to understand what he's talking about with the warrior spirit and how that aspect has been taken
Yeah.
out of modern society. But I was kind of interested in what he would think about
Mhm.
uh, how do I put it? I guess it's like to me it feels like it relates to the meaning of the Crusades, even though it maybe not have been mentioned in there. But this
Yeah.
kind of attitude uh of um how do I say? It
That's
seems like
interesting.
the attitude of the warrior spirit is as much kind of uh it requires as much kind of faith in the not really necessarily in the like blind faith sense, but it requires an attitude that you are definitely right and the other person is wrong. And that's an aspect that obviously again is downplayed in modern society. Oh, you have to be tolerant of everything,
Yeah, that's a
so
good point. Yeah, it's a
so
very good point.
so and Evola to me it seems like he would be of a he would have something interesting to say about it, because on one hand he does a very interesting thing of trying to draw all the parallels between the different traditions, and yet advocating the warrior view, which kind of implies that prioritizing one above the others. So he's kind of Evola's in between, personally, maybe.
You think he's in between?
Well, no, all I say, I mean, Evola will actually not exactly in between. Evola
Okay.
will say his values are obviously the correct values, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So that, but then that's because of his own individual like formulation. So I guess uh that is different from what I'm talking about, where the warrior spirit is kind of maybe it's clearer if I think about the warrior spirit in relation to the Brahmin, which he says is the spiritual authority. In other words, to exercise warrior spirit, a warrior must believe their way of life is superior and everyone else is worse, something like that. So Evola does believe something like that in terms of his idea of hierarchy, but at the same time, he's kind of doing it in a everyone believes they themselves are the most right. He's trying to show that, I guess, is one way of putting it by comparing all the cultures.
Yeah, perhaps. Perhaps. I mean, he's on the side of tradition, right? And because he's on the side of tradition, he can look at the Crusades and say, well, these Christians over here who mounted the crusade against the Islamic world, I can understand them. And at the same time, the Arab Knights, as he calls them, this essay, I can understand them as well. He's really in a bizarre sense, he's saying they're both right from the point of view of transcendent principles, isn't he?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is the interesting way he can be in between, because he can say that they're both right, but then he can also say it's good that they think they are both right.
Yeah, but it's not clear what side he would have taken if he had lived
Yes,
then.
exactly.
Right. Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, in the sense of the warrior spirit, and when it comes to tradition, of course, he's very uncompromising. And I mean, let's just try and resolve this question of being in between. It seems to me it's not at all clear. Sorry, it is clear. Not it's not it's not at all unclear. I meant to say that he did not advocate a particular religion. I mean, the real odd man out is the doctrine of awakening, because he almost seems to be saying, but then when you look at the rest of his work, even if he is saying nice things about Buddhism, in his same lifetime, he said really great things about many other traditions, and he wrote a whole thing on Zen, the religion of the samurai. Okay, that's Buddhism again, but then he's got this thing on the Tantra, so I think that Evola is very much his own person.
Yeah.
And to try and pigeonhole him or reduce him to just like a little card, and you write down fascist, Nazi, whatever. I don't think he can reduce to just like simple labels that you could write on an index card. He's a complex figure. He's his own person, and highly intelligent individuals like himself cannot easily be put into conventional categories. So Evola is Evola, and Evola was was very uncompromising about the things he stood for, right? The full range of things he stood for. And I think that is so refreshing, because you have so many people who are just prevaricators, and they want to be all things to everybody. And most people today don't stand for anything. And that's again why I like his discussion of mountain climbing. You've got to be fully committed. You can't sort of be hanging on a rope, you've got to hold on to that. You're going to fall. But again, maybe that's not a good example. I don't know about mountain climbing. I've never been mountain climbing. But I was very interested in the martial arts, and I also had a very similar kind of understanding that Evola puts forward, that a lot of these intellectuals, me as an academic, I would just see all day. I would just see, excuse me for saying this, but I would just see just a bunch of bullshitters all day.
Yeah.
In martial arts, you can't BS it, man. You just can't. You either do the punch or correctly, or you've done the kick or whatever it is correctly, or the block, or your stance is good or it's not good. So you have to be fully committed. And for example, in kendo, when you stand in kendo, the kendo match is 120 seconds. That's it. 2 minutes. And of course, you don't have real swords. You have these bamboo things which are in the place of swords, but it's absolutely intense. And you have to stand with a certain stance, and you have to be prepared to hold that stance. And that sword is positioned, or the bamboo sword called the Shīʿah is positioned so that if you extend a line from the tip, it's pointing to the neck of your opponent. And if you deviate, he will get you. I mean, so my point is, you have to be uncompromising in your stance, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So to speak, when we transfer it out of the realm of the martial arts, but you must be uncompromising in your stance. And if you don't focus, the other person will advance on you. And if it's a real fight, he will either kill you or you will be very badly injured. And to translate that into the intellectual domain, where people vigorously engage in debate and uphold their ideals and the things which they subscribe to, this is just not very much there anymore.
Yeah, what that you just said reminds me of, I'm sure he might have written about this, but the old tradition of how philosophical schools also meant a way of life, where you had the master and you had the school, and they went to almost local war with the other schools at some point. I'm thinking of ancient Greece, when Cynic used to be an actual name of a school, things like that. So this idea of spirituality as a way of life having to be integrated, that's definitely how about the most traditional you can get in terms of how you describe traditional life.
I don't know how true these accounts are, but I mean, because I'm not a specialist in the study of the Indic traditions, but what I've heard from other specialists is that there would be debates, and so apparently one of the reasons that Buddhism was almost eliminated in India, where it started, was supposedly because of the debate, or the claim is made of the debating skills of the Vedantic master Shankaracharya. And so they would have these debates between these schools or monasteries or what have you, and he would best them in the debate. And so all of these Buddhists would have to become Vedantic. So whether that's true or not, but that was the idea, that if it is shown that the doctrines on which you stand are problematic, or can be established through some rigorous or logical argument, so that we can show that you have some ambiguous terms or false premises, or the syllogism is invalid, then it's all over for that school, right?
Yeah, I think that does make sense. Well, I mean, I've heard that it was such a big tradition that probably happened. Yeah, like in terms of the public debate was like a show for them as well.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that whole tradition of scholastic Buddhism only was transferred into Tibet, or at least that's the claim that's made, that the traditions of Nalanda basically just ended up being en masse almost translated and shifted and taken over there.
Yeah, that seems true. I've read a bit about the subject, and it seems like scholasticism, as it's in other different religions as well, the most parallels are in Tibet, I suppose. Yeah.
Probably, yeah, probably right.
And I guess to kind of remark on a funny thing now that it's we've been going for a while. When he talked, that brief aside about skiing, I thought it was interesting how he described it, like going skiing is like learning how to drive fast in a car in a chaotic way,
Yeah.
you know. So it might be full of excitement, and that's the main draw of it.
It is. I mean, I've only been skiing once or twice in my life, and I'd never done it before. And I remember I just went and I just jumped off of the ski lift, and it was really exciting. It was very exciting, but that was about it, and you just come all the way down the mountain, you go back and you do it again. You don't even have to. He often he remarks about that also, that you don't have to climb back up. They have the ski
Yeah.
lift, and you just jump off of it. So it is interesting. Yeah, I don't know anybody else. None of the other traditionalist authors remarked on skiing. More than one has remarked on mountain climbing and passing, or in some way or another. But skiing, he's the only one.
I just found it interesting when he mentioned it, because, and you mentioned your own example of martial arts to relate to the mountain climbing.
Yeah.
The thing I found that kind of relates to skiing, but maybe a bit more than just going downhill, is horse riding, because I do that, and or I'm learning to do it, and it's kind of a thing where you have to learn to control your body, and as well, and it is exciting, and maybe it can be a little more as well, because there is a kind of split decision, but also you have to be calm, and all of that. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely true. There's all sorts of physical culture, but about skiing, I wonder if he had lived into now and seen these so-called extreme sports.
Oh yeah.
And people are just going, again, they're just going for the adrenaline rush, because they are so bored with modern life in the cities, in the urban areas, but just the banality and the meaninglessness of most of modern life, that they go for these experiences where their heart rate and everything goes up, and they actually talk about how they actually feel alive because they're so bored. And that's really strange, and at the same time it's really pathetic as well. It's that they have no other outlet. There's no kind of spiritual experience, there's no contemplative discipline, there's no meditative practice, there's no worship, there's nothing with most people today. And so if they're not doing extreme sports, they're involved in all sorts of either drugs or alcohol, or probably all of those go together too. Extreme sports, especially alcohol, is a big part of the life of modern people.
Yeah.
So anyway. Well, do you have anything else?
I think yeah, I think that covers it so far. As we go read a bit more of the Metaphysics of War, I think that'll be interesting.
Absolutely. Well, so maybe we'll just conclude now, and we'll pick this up tomorrow then.
Sure. Great.